So I would say no, and it by extension of my previous answer, you shouldn't do it alone, because all those things involve both expertise and domains of human experience that are beyond economics. You mentioned, of course, a large array of different problems, but so just picking in no specific order, it would be preposterous to try to understand race relations from the point of view of economics, because it would be ahistoric, it would be outside the social context in which they happen, and it would even be outside of the psychological way in which race is constructed and understood. So it shouldn't. Having said that, it should complement the insights of all these other disciplines into race relations, because there is an important economic aspect. We know from the study of history of slavery and all sorts of other important determinants of race relations, that they had an economic basis, that they were a way of producing exactly profits and helping consumption and increasing capital and so on and so forth. So in that sense, economics can help, so that again, just by studying race relations alone, without any mention of the economic aspects and the economic dimensions, itself would be deficient. So if we're only trying to understand race by the social and historic and psychological aspects, so economics has to provide some part of the context, but not the entire context. Moving on to the other things that you mentioned, and I think we can talk about climate a bit more in the other questions as well. But climate, again, it's a multi-layered and multifaceted problem that economics alone cannot tackle, because it relates to the physical planet. So you need to understand the climatology, you need to understand the atmospheric science and how carbon enters and disappears from the cycle, and how an increase in carbon concentration will lead to a rise in temperatures and things like that. So this is all science that it's largely independent of economics, because you're now talking at the molecular and in some cases even more fundamental quantum mechanical interactions that are happening there. So you might say, okay, then climate doesn't have anything to do with economics, and we can decouple the two. But both climate scientists and economists understood long ago that that's not the case, because the reason why carbon concentrations are increasing is because of industrial production and other aspects of modern life that have an economic component. Again, just like in race relations, the economics plays a very important role in determining how much of that production and consumption and so on and so forth is going to be dumping not only carbon but other types of secondary wasteful products into the environment. And so that was always somewhat understood, and then more recently, and this is where the discussion on climate change became much more connected to economics, is the other way around, is that the climate itself, by reaching limits of how much it can absorb of all of this industrial waste and carbon increase, when it gets stretched to the limit that it cannot absorb it too much more without changing the physical constraints of the climate itself, and changing by not only increasing the temperature, but then changing all sorts of sea currents and other climate modules and climate components, then that has an impact on the economy, right? So the economy has an impact on the climate by, say, simplistically, by increasing emissions, but then the climate will have an impact on the economy by simply decreasing the amount of capital and the amount of production that you can make by actually, damaging. And this goes into this very controversial topic of damage functions, how to quantify. It's very difficult, but it's undeniable that there is a feedback effect from the climate into the economy. The most obvious one is just damages that are caused by extreme climate events, floods, and so on and so forth. But there's damage in terms of loss of productivity. There's damage in terms of higher depreciation of capital, and all sorts of other ways in which then the climate now can be a substantial drag in the economy. And I'm not talking about the type of marginal changes, because there's the another sort of coming back from the abstract studies in economics, is that another belief is that there's an equilibrium from which you only deviate in small amounts. There's small shocks to the equilibrium, and then the economic system itself will bring it back by responding to those shocks in some optimal way. And typically this is done in, talking mathematically for a moment, this is done in a linear fashion. So that means that you only look at the small effects and then the small responses to those effects. But the issues that like we're talking about, the changes that happen in the climate and this big integrated systems for the planet as a whole, the changes are not small. They might start small, but then you have very large bifurcations, so to speak. That means that the overall effect of these small changes is a completely different path than you started before. And at that point, then, the response of the economic system to this large change in the physical system is not going to be small either. So you're going to have damages and destruction and loss of output that are not linearly related to what the shocks were. They're much larger than what the original shocks were. And at that point, then it becomes very important to understand this relationship. So there's non-linear feedbacks between the climate and economics. But I feel that I've moved, just like talking about bifurcations, I moved too far away from the start of the question. But it's trying to come back. So does economics do a good job in understanding or helping this other discipline? So I think we'll go back to something that I said in the previous questions. It does, to the extent that it provides the sort of the grounding for some of the questions that need to be asked, because these are not disconnected from issues of production and consumption and profits and capital. But it's not all that is, right? So you cannot understand the climate, and in particular, you cannot try to force the theoretical framework that is used for economic systems into other disciplines and into the understanding of other type of phenomena. A typical example that I give in connection to climate is that the so-called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models that are very much in vogue in macroeconomics, at the core, there's this mechanism for adjusting to deviations from equilibrium, and the adjustments are done by adjusting expectations. And because a rational agent will see that that deviation from equilibrium can move the system to a very undesirable state, and because the undesirable state is worse than the desirable state, no rational person will continue in a path of something that you know it's going to be worse. So you adjust. But the technique was invented for things that have to do with variables that are very much sensitive to those expectations. So the classical example and the example, that's how the technique was invented by people like Sargent, famous economist, is inflation expectations and expectations with respect to interest rates and their relationship to inflation. So if you see a path where you're either going to have persistent deflation or explosive inflation, what you do is to adjust your expectations. So there's an instantaneous adjustment in prices and everything else that depend on future inflation, so that you're restored to the equilibrium path. Okay, but that just doesn't work for a climate mechanism, because you cannot simply adjust emissions by adjusting your expectations. You can adjust prices. Prices are, after all, more or less constructions. People agree to pay or not to pay a given price, but there's no issue to agree with the environment of what the level of emission is going to be. It's there, and once it's there, it takes its time, and the time is dictated by something that is completely outside the realm of the expectation of economic agents. It's really now a physical process, and the physical process is an out of equilibrium, slowly adjusting physical mechanism. So trying to couple a equilibrium instantaneously adjusting framework, which is what happens in dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, which are also the models that are behind many of the climate economic integrated models, such as DICE and other models. Trying to shoehorn a equilibrium instantaneously adjusting framework into an out of equilibrium slowly adjusting climate framework just doesn't work. It's orthogonal. It's methodologically impossible to reconcile. So that should not be the way that economics is integrated with other disciplines, in particular with climate. So what do? In the battle of what to adjust, you don't adjust the climate science, you adjust the economics. You then try to see what are models that are compatible with this type of out of equilibrium dynamics and with this type of non-clearing, so the conditions are not going to be matched all the time. And if they're not matched, then what type of slowly adjusting dynamics you can have, with the possibility of overshooting, with the possibility of cycles, with the possibility of oscillations that just increase and get out of hand, and so on and so forth. All of the dynamic phenomena that are not there in the equilibrium framework of economics that were designed for markets and relationships in which maybe expectations play an oversized role. But for example, financial markets, it's clear that expectations play an oversized role in there. It's all that dictates the problem, but perhaps not all, but it's like to first approximation is what dictates the price of financial securities. So maybe that's appropriate for that, but it's not appropriate for interaction with the climate, for example.